We had planned for a weekend of solitude, a break from the chaos of daily life. Just me, my sister Rachel, and our two loyal dogs, Scout and Luna, deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains. No crowds, no campgrounds, just untouched wilderness and the kind of quiet that makes you forget the rest of the world exists. The area was known for its dispersed camping spots, remote and without amenities. Exactly what we wanted. It was supposed to be a weekend of relaxation, of hiking, fishing, and nights spent under the stars. But we never expected we'd leave with the uneasy feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far worse. We arrived at our campsite just past noon, navigating a narrow dirt road that cut through towering pines and jagged rock formations. The spot we found was ideal, a flat clearing near a small creek with a fire pit left behind by previous campers. As far as we could tell, we were completely alone, and that was just how we liked it. The dogs, always excited to be outdoors, roamed the perimeter of the site, sniffing and marking their new territory. Scout, my blue heeler, was calm and steady, rarely barking unless something truly unsettled him. Luna, Rachel's Norwegian elk-hound, was the opposite, hyper-aware and fiercely protective. Together, they were our personal alarm system, a layer of security we never doubted. We were halfway through setting up our tent when we heard the crunch of footsteps on the trail leading up to our site. Two men, both in their early 30s, emerged from the trees. They were dressed casually in hiking boots, jeans, and flannel shirts, each carrying a backpack. At first glance, they looked like any other campers, but something about them immediately felt off. The dogs reacted before we did. Scout, who almost never showed aggression, tensed, his hackles rising. He let out a deep, rumbling growl, a sound that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Luna was even more intense, stepping in front of Rachel and me, her teeth bared in a vicious snarl. The men stopped in their tracks, standing about 20 feet away, hands in their pockets, watching us. They made no move to come closer, nor did they turn and leave. An uneasy silence stretched between us, the only sound the low growls from our dogs. Finally, after what felt like forever, one of them muttered something to the other, and they backed away, disappearing into the trees. The dogs didn't relax until long after they were gone. Rachel and I exchanged uneasy glances, but we tried to brush it off. Maybe they were just passing through, curious about who else was camping nearby. But as the afternoon wore on, we saw them again, always at a distance, never close enough to interact, but always lurking, always watching. It wasn't normal. They weren't hiking. They weren't setting up camp. They were just there. As the sun began to set, the forest took on an eerie stillness. We kept the fire high and stayed close to the dogs, who refused to settle. Scout, usually content to lay by the fire, sat stiff and alert, his eyes locked on the dark tree line. Luna paced, ears twitching at every rustle in the underbrush. We debated packing up and leaving, but the idea of navigating the treacherous dirt road in the dark felt just as dangerous. We decided to wait it out until morning, taking turns keeping watch. Sometime around midnight, Scout let out a low, guttural growl, his body rigid. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees, but the beam only caught the rough bark of pines and the occasional glint of pine needles. No movement, no sound, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. Neither of us slept. The night dragged on, every snapped twig or distant rustle sending adrenaline coursing through us. When morning finally came, the sunlight brought a sense of false security, but we couldn't ignore the fact that we were being stalked. We decided to wait for Mark and James, our boyfriends, who were due to arrive later that afternoon. The hours crawled by, but the men never reappeared. For a while, we thought maybe we had overreacted. Maybe they had moved on. Mark and James finally showed up around 4 in the afternoon, their truck kicking up a cloud of dust as it pulled into the clearing. The relief was instant. With them there, we felt protected. Both of them were the kind of guys who could handle themselves in a fight, and suddenly, the woods didn't feel as threatening. That night, with 4 of us there, the tension eased slightly. We built a bigger fire, cooked a proper meal, and tried to laugh off the previous night's paranoia. The dogs, too, seemed calmer, resting by the fire with their heads on their paws. But just as the last light faded from the sky, Luna's ears shot up. She lifted her head, nose twitching, then let out a deep, low growl. Scout followed immediately, staring into the dark trees beyond our campsite. Mark and James were on their feet in an instant, scanning the perimeter with their flashlights. They didn't see anything, but they weren't about to ignore the dog's reaction. We decided we weren't taking any chances. The fire stayed burning all night, and we took shifts watching the tree line. By morning, nothing had happened. No footprints, no signs of movement, no indication that anyone had been there at all. But we weren't fooled. As we packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dense trees, half expecting to see those men standing there, just out of reach. But the forest was empty. Too empty. The only sounds were the birds chirping and the wind whispering through the branches. We never saw those men again. Maybe they were just drifters, passing through. Or maybe they had worse intentions but were scared off by the dogs and the arrival of Mark and James. Either way, I know one thing for certain. Those men weren't just hikers. They were predators, waiting for the right moment. And if we had been alone for one more night, I don't know how this story would have ended. Even now, years later, I trust my instincts more than ever. I still go camping, but I never go unarmed. And I never ignore the warnings of my dogs. Because in the wilderness, the most dangerous thing isn't always the wildlife. It's the people hiding in the trees, watching, waiting. What do you think they wanted? Were they just passing through? Or were they planning something worse? The moment I saw the cabin listing online, I knew it was exactly what I needed. A secluded, rustic getaway buried deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. No Wi-Fi, no distractions, and no neighbors for miles. Just me, the crisp autumn air, and the silence I craved after months of burnout. I was running on empty, drained from work stress and a messy breakup, and this place felt like a lifeline, a chance to reset. But looking back, I should have trusted my instincts the moment I arrived. Something was off. I just didn't realize how much until it was too late. The drive took longer than expected. The last stretch of road little more than a rutted path winding through the dense forest. The sun was already dipping low by the time I pulled up to the cabin. It was exactly like the pictures. A single-story wooden structure with a sloped roof, a fire pit out front, and a neat stack of firewood leaning against the side. But the moment I stepped out of the car, an unease settled over me. The air was too still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unnatural quiet, as if the woods were holding their breath. Shaking off the paranoia, I unloaded my gear, locked the car, and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable. A tiny kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with a composting toilet. The windows were large, letting in plenty of natural light, but they made me feel exposed, like something, or someone, could be watching. I brushed it off as city paranoia. I wanted solitude, and that's exactly what I got. That first night, I fell asleep to the crackle of the fire, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around me like a cocoon. But something woke me in the middle of the night. A sound, faint, distant. At first, I thought it was the wind, but no breeze stirred outside. It almost sounded like a voice, a low, garbled murmur, too distorted to make out words. I sat up, listening. Nothing, just silence stretching out endlessly. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke to golden light spilling through the trees. I spent the day exploring the trails, hiking through the crisp autumn air, enjoying the solitude. But when I returned to the cabin that afternoon, something was different. Near the fire pit, a small stack of rocks had been carefully balanced into a formation that hadn't been there before. A simple cairn, but one I hadn't built. I stood frozen, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. Nothing, just trees stretching endlessly into the distance. I told myself I must have overlooked it when I arrived, but the unease coiled in my gut like a warning. That night, I double-checked the locks and closed the curtains before crawling into bed. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustling leaf outside, sent my heart racing. At some point, Exhaustion took over, and I slipped into restless sleep. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin, chopping firewood and keeping myself busy. But as I was stacking logs near the porch, I saw it. Just off the side of the cabin, half hidden in the dirt. A footprint. Not mine. Larger, deeper, and fresher than anything I could have left behind. My stomach clenched. I wasn't alone out here. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone passing through. But why wouldn't they make themselves known? Why the silence? I tried to shake it off, but a tension settled over me, impossible to ignore. By the time night fell, I was on edge, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. Then, just past midnight, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching against fallen leaves. I held my breath, listening. A pause. Then the unmistakable creak of the porch steps. Someone was outside. My blood turned to ice. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand but didn't turn it on, afraid of letting whoever, or whatever, was out there know I was awake. The footsteps stopped. Silence. The kind that felt deafening. And then, the sound of breathing. Low, slow, just beyond the door. I stayed frozen, knife clutched in my trembling hand. Minutes passed. Maybe an hour. I don't know. Eventually, the sound faded, the footsteps retreating back into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, I stepped outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. More footprints. This time, they circled the cabin. My mind raced through every possibility, none of them good. Whoever it was had been watching, waiting. For what? I wasn't about to find out. I packed up in record time, throwing my gear into the car without bothering to organize it. As I pulled away, my hands clenched the wheel, my eyes darting to the trees on either side of the road. The feeling of being watched never left. Every shadow looked like a figure, every rustling leaf a sign that something was following. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the sheriff's office, recounting everything. The stacked rocks, the footprints, the sounds in the night. The deputy listened, nodding. But there was something in his expression that unsettled me even more. Like he'd heard this before. Like he already knew. Probably just some drifters, he said, jotting down my report. Happens sometimes. Folks out here, they don't always take kindly to outsiders. Next time, pick a spot with neighbors. I left feeling more uneasy than before. If he wasn't surprised, then how many times had this happened? And if it was just drifters, then why did it feel like something worse? I'll never know who was out there that night, or what they wanted. But one thing is certain, I'll never book a cabin that deep in the woods again. But the part that still keeps me up at night? The footprints didn't lead away. They just stopped. Like whoever was watching me had never left. I used to believe that fear was something you could outgrow, something you could toughen up against. That was before that night in Clearview State Park, before the quiet of the mountains turned from peaceful to suffocating. Before I realized that sometimes fear isn't irrational, it's a warning. A feeling that sticks to your bones long after the moment has passed. Paul and I had planned this trip for months. It was late October, and the crisp air and golden aspens made the mountains feel like something out of a painting. The campground was tucked deep in the woods of Colorado, away from the distractions of daily life. No cell service, no internet, no city noise, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional crackle of our campfire. It was exactly what we needed. We had rented a small, rustic cabin at the edge of the campground. It wasn't anything fancy, just a bed, a table, and a tiny wood stove to keep the autumn chill at bay. But that was the appeal. Something about stripping life down to the basics made everything feel simpler, like we could breathe a little easier. The first day passed in a blur of long hikes and laughter, the kind of effortless joy that comes from stepping away from responsibilities. We spent hours exploring the trails, spotting deer between the trees, and taking in the solitude. By the time the sun dipped below the mountains, we were exhausted in the best way. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I felt like I could finally let go of all the stress that had been weighing on me. Then the night changed. After dinner, I decided to take a quick shower before bed. The cabin didn't have running water, so we had to use the shared bathhouse, a short walk down the gravel path. Paul offered to go with me, but I waved him off. It was only a few minutes away, and I had already gone alone the night before. I grabbed my towel, my phone, and set off into the night. The gravel crunched under my boots as I walked. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. I didn't bother turning on my flashlight. The moon was bright enough to guide me. But as I neared the bathhouse, I saw him. A man sat on a bench outside the entrance, hunched over with a bottle in his hand. He looked disheveled, his clothes wrinkled and stained. A baseball cap pulled low over his face. His campsite must have been nearby, though I hadn't seen him earlier. I told myself he was just another camper, maybe drunk but harmless. Then he mumbled something. I couldn't make out the words, but his voice was slurred, thick with alcohol. I quickened my pace, hoping to get inside without interacting. But as I passed, I heard his footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around. My pulse quickened as I realized he wasn't just shifting in place. He was following me. I tightened my grip on my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen to call Paul. But then I remembered, Paul had left his phone charging in the cabin. He wouldn't see my call. I was on my own. I reached the door, yanked it open, and slammed it shut behind me, my hands shaking as I locked it. The bathhouse was empty, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting long, unnatural shadows against the concrete walls. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The gravel outside shifted. He was still there. For a split second, I considered confronting him. I wasn't the type to back down easily, but something told me not to open that door. I tried calling Paul anyway, even knowing it would go to voicemail. My hands trembled as I sent a text instead, hoping he would see it when I got back. Minutes passed, then an hour. I peeked through the tiny window near the ceiling. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then I caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. He was still there, pacing. I felt trapped, like an animal cornered in its den. Then, finally, movement again. But this time, it was Paul. I almost sobbed with relief when I saw him walking down the path, flashlight in hand. He must have realized I was gone too long. I hesitated, watching to make sure the man had left before pushing the door open and running toward Paul. I barely managed to get the words out, my voice shaking as I told him what had happened. Paul's face darkened. He clenched his fists, jaw tight. "Let's report it," he said. The campground's ranger station was closed for the night, but an emergency number was posted outside. Paul made the call, giving them the man's description and telling them where his campsite was. The ranger on the other end assured us they'd handle it. I didn't sleep that night. Paul sat by the window, watching. I lay in bed, listening for footsteps that never came, staring at the ceiling, wondering what could have happened if I hadn't locked that door. The next morning, a ranger came by. He told us they had spoken to the man. He claimed he had just been trying to make conversation and didn't mean to scare anyone. They gave him a warning. If there were any more complaints, he'd be removed from the campground. That was it. I felt sick. A warning. That was all he got. Paul and I made the decision right then and there to leave. We packed up, loaded the car, and drove out of the park. But even as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Looking back, I don't know what his intentions were, and I don't think I want to know. But one thing is certain, fear like that doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It sharpens you, makes you more aware of how quickly things can turn from normal to something else entirely. And sometimes, it makes you realize that the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones standing right in front of you. What do you think? Was this man just a drunk camper who didn't understand boundaries, or was it something more sinister? Have you ever had a moment where you knew, deep down, that something was off? I used to love the solitude of the woods. There was something about the quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being truly alone with nature that made me feel at peace. But after what happened that weekend in northern Michigan, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the deep woods again. It started with a simple plan. I had been staying at a campground the night before, but something had unsettled me. When I woke up that morning, someone had left a half-eaten fast food meal at my campsite, right next to my RV. Worse, my camping chair, the one I had folded and set aside before going to bed, was open, as if someone had sat in it overnight while I slept inside, completely unaware. The idea that someone had been that close while I was oblivious made my skin crawl. I mentioned it to the park ranger before I left, but I didn't stick around long enough to hear what he thought. Instead, I changed my plans. I had originally intended to stay at another campsite for the next few days, but the thought of being around strangers after what had happened put me on edge. I needed real isolation, somewhere deep in the woods, far from anyone else. That's when I remembered the cabin. It was a place I had rented a few times before, tucked away in a remote part of the northern Michigan wilderness near Red Creek. No electricity, no running water, no cell service. Just a single-room cabin with a wood stove, a porch, and nothing but trees for miles. It was exactly what I needed. At least, that's what I thought. On my way there, I stopped in a small-town grocery store and stocked up on essentials, canned goods, bottled water, coffee, and an extra box of ammunition for my revolver. After the incident at the campground, the thought of being armed gave me a small sense of control, even if I hoped I wouldn't need it. The drive to the cabin was rough. The dirt road leading up to it was little more than a forgotten path, riddled with potholes and barely wide enough for my truck. The deeper I went, the thicker the trees became, their bare branches twisting against the gray autumn sky. By the time I pulled up to the clearing, the sun was already sinking, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The cabin looked the same as it always had, small, weathered, and quiet. A single wooden chair sat on the porch next to a stack of firewood. The air smelled damp, like the woods had been holding on to the last bit of rain from earlier that week. I unpacked, set up inside, and lit a fire in the stove. The familiar warmth of the place settled me, at least for a little while. The first night passed without issue. I cooked a small meal, read a book by lantern light, and fell asleep early. The woods were silent, eerily so. There were no night birds calling, no rustling leaves, just the occasional pop of the fire. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that the chair on the porch had moved. The night before, I had set it against the cabin wall. Now, it was positioned differently, angled toward the yard, as if someone had been sitting in it, watching the trees. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at it. Had I moved it and forgotten? No, I knew I hadn't. The cabin was remote. No one should have been out there. And yet, the chair had moved. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking the soft, damp earth for footprints, but there was nothing. No tracks, no tire marks on the dirt road except for mine. The air felt different now. Heavy, like the forest was pressing in. I spent the day hiking along the creek, trying to shake the unease. The crisp autumn air should have felt refreshing, but instead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, just out of sight. When I returned in the late afternoon, something new was waiting for me. A crumpled, dirty napkin lay on the porch, just a few feet from the chair. It was the kind of napkin you'd get from a fast food joint, stained with grease and folded like someone had used it and then tossed it aside. I stood there, my pulse thudding in my ears. There was no way I had left it there. I hadn't brought any fast food with me. Someone had been here. That night, I locked the doors and windows, my revolver resting within arm's reach. I sat in the dark, the fire burning low in the stove, listening. Every creak of the old cabin, every distant rustle in the woods made my skin prickle. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke, the lantern I had left on the table was gone. My breath hitched as I sat up, scanning the room. The door was still locked. The windows were unbroken, but the lantern was missing, along with the pack of matches I had left beside it. I stepped outside, gripping my revolver tight, and there it was. The lantern was sitting in the middle of the yard, upright, unbroken, placed there, not dropped, not thrown, set down carefully, deliberately. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my things in record time, stuffing them into the truck without caring how they fit. The woods felt suffocating now, the trees standing too close, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. When I reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner for coffee. I mentioned to the waitress that I had been staying near Red Creek, expecting her to nod and say something about how quiet it was out there. Instead, she gave me a strange look. "You're lucky you got out of there," she said. I didn't ask her to explain. I didn't want to know. Even now, back at home, I can't stop thinking about it. The moved chair, the dirty napkin, the missing lantern, all of it could be explained away. If it had been just one thing, I could dismiss it. But together, it painted a picture I couldn't ignore. Someone had been out there, watching, and I still don't know what they wanted. I haven't been back to the woods since. Maybe I never will. What do you think really happened? Would you have stayed another night?